I'd like to welcome everybody to this month's happy hour. We're going to be talking about fencing, and so really quick, we usually start off with, does anybody have any news from around the herd they want to share?
First SCI babies are due Tuesday.
Yay! Anyone else?
I mean, we talked about weather. I mean, it was cool to see the San Clemente's get through these cold temps pretty unaffected. So
that is really a huge selling point, I think, their adaptability. So thank you guys up north for sharing that information. So there's no major SCI GBA news, so I guess we'll just get into tonight's topic. We are so lucky to have with us SCI breeder Stephanie Bowers from Glorious Goat Ranch in Wisconsin, who will be leading a discussion on fencing. What as the saying goes, if it won't hold water, it won't hold goats. So fencing is definitely something that is always on a goat breeder's mind. So thank you, Stephanie, so much, and I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, you're welcome. First off, a tech check. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Because technology is wonderful when it works. Yeah, so I'm Stephanie. Thanks for the intro. I've got a good handful of San Clemente Island goats, and they have been a fun learning experience about how to keep them where I want them, along with all the other crazy goats. So I thought that tonight I would just be really interactive, ask questions anytime. It's how we learn. I thought it would be more of a fun discussion as opposed to a sit and listen to somebody talk. So fencing strategies for goats, I thought a more accurate title would be, keeping goats where you want them. So it has been said that you can keep cattle in with one strand of fence, which you can, and then horses and sheep, and then goats do best in a padded room. And that can be true. So what I have learned over my experiences, so my background, I suppose I should start there. I've been around cows my entire life, so I know an awful lot about fencing cattle. And we ventured into the small ruminant space 3 or 4 years ago. So I did a lot of research on, what kind of fence should we have, etc. And then you start with one thing, and then you learn. And what we learned really quickly is that if a fence can't hold water, it can't hold a goat. So welcome to the escape goat clause. Yes, indeed, goats are fun. So one thing we also learned really quickly was that goats are crafty little buggers, and their curiosity means that they can easily get stuck in the fence. I'm guessing everyone who's ever had a goat has had a goat that's gotten stuck in the fence. So I want to dig into that a little more as to fence sizing and spacing, and yeah, goats are fun. So going back to goats getting stuck in fences, well, first off, there's a couple different kinds of fences. Like there's your physical fence, there's virtual fencing, and then even within physical fencing, there's woven wire fence, there's electric fence, there's wooden fence, there's all kinds of different fences. And so what I have learned in my experience with fencing goats is the best fence is I use a lot of the it's got 4x4 spacing, or even smaller to 3x3. Actually, most of mine is 3x3 now, because what I found is that baby goats will once they get their little horn nubs, they will actually get caught in 4x4 fencing, and then they can't get out. And then so I try to make sure that any non-electric fence is smaller than 4x4 if you're dealing with a young kid. Once they're a couple months old, eventually their heads will be big enough where they can't get their heads stuck as much anymore. Especially the horned goats are more of a challenge. Some people, I didn't find a good picture They're called a variety of things. Stupid stick is the one that I know, where you take a yardstick and you can tape it to the horns of your goat if your goat is repetitively sticking its head in places it shouldn't be. But instead of stupid sticking our goats, we've just switched to smaller fencing. And then also, depending upon the size of the group, switching up the fence that we have. Like, if it's baby goats, then making sure those spaces are really small. If it's bigger goats, then experimenting with some of the larger woven wire. So like the woven wire in this picture, obviously they'll get their heads stuck in. There is one kind of woven wire that it's 6 by 12-inch spacing, and I haven't tried it personally, but I intend on installing that when we put in our perimeter fence this year. And that fence is big enough that most goats that get their heads through it can actually get their heads back out without intervention. So I'm curious, what kinds of fencing do you guys use?
We've got the field fence, just the red brand field fence, and I'm just sitting here thinking there is absolutely no way I could afford 4x4 fencing of any kind, because we're fencing 40 acres and like 7 different pastures, and I'm like, you're just gonna have to get your head stuck, and if you die, I'll buy another one. I mean, I don't mean that. I really wouldn't. I'm going to get them out because I check them every day, but it's just not financially possible. Maybe in a small pen, but
yeah. So that's why for my perimeter fence, now that I've talked to enough other producers, I'm looking at that 6 by 12. There's a grazer in southern Wisconsin where she's got 40 acres fenced in, and she went with the traditional sizing. And every now and again, she has a goat that gets stuck, but not that often. So the ones that do get stuck, she stupid sticks them, and that's where I learned the term stupid stick. And she hasn't necessarily lost any animals that way, but it's a concern for her of predators. So what she found was that if a goat got its head stuck, they have LGDs. So one of the guard dogs would actually stay by the goat that was stuck. But it's just part of that, like, check your perimeters every day. And then, going from there. So, and that you're definitely right. The smaller the fencing, the more expensive it gets. We have goats that their names are liquid and solid for a reason because I had kids that named them. But they would even squeeze out in the space between a gate and where the gate connects. Like, there'd be like a 2 or 3 inch space, and their kids are little enough to squeeze through. So that's really frustrating. But usually, I guess a lot of fencing goes back to the psychology of goats. Like, why are we using fence? Obviously, we want to keep them in certain places, but what are their motivations for sticking their heads through the fence? Like, there's obviously curiosity. Oh, I totally forgot to share that picture. We'll get there. They're just so curious. Let me see. So I guess where I learned a lot was we use these red feeders a lot in some of our smaller groups. And this is where I learned that it was 4x4 spacing where the kids would get caught. So obviously this is not fence, but feeders are important too. So we use these feeders, and we really like them for the small goats. What we learned is when the goats get bigger, unless it's secured to something, they'll flip it over because goats are jerks. So in all of the things that we've learned with our feeders, we've gone to 3-inch bar spacings. Seem to be the best bet for an animal to get its nose in without getting its head in and without getting caught. So another kind of fencing that we use a lot in grazing is electronet fencing. So a lot of times, as long as the goats, so the psychology of goats, I guess I wanted to talk a little more about that. So what we've learned is it comes down to psychology, right? So an electric fence is not a physical barrier, it's a psychological barrier. The goat learns that if they touch the fence, they're going to get a negative reaction, if you will. So they'll get a shock, and that tells them that, gee, touching this fence is a bad idea. So what we've learned is that if you have an electric fence, you absolutely positively have to have it hot. It has to be on all the time. Otherwise, you can just run into issues. So like with this Electronet, it works really well once the animals are trained, but if you're not careful, the animals can get tangled up in this. So why would an animal get tangled up in the Electronet? If it's running from predators, it could get tangled up. If the fence isn't electric and the goat is just being a goat and sticks its head in, and then once they get tangled, they can strangle themselves. So some people, that's obviously a huge challenge. And then depending upon the Electronet, a lot of what we use is it's 35 inches tall. So it's a short fence. So the goats could clear it, like the San Clemente's especially could easily clear this fence. But when we train our animals, it's making sure that they have those herd dynamics, their food and their friends. So they're not motivated to escape. They're relying on us, their shepherds, to know when they're running out of feed and then give them the next break of food. So that's how we use a lot of Electronet. Do any of you guys have any? I know Erin has experience with some Electronet. Anybody else?
Yeah, we've been using electric netting since 2008, and hot and training is really essential. Literally, and it's not just one goat. We've watched goats over the years, like mamas. They'll be grazing the fence line and they'll have new kids, and they'll like hip check kids into the netting to see if it's on or not, and you end up with kids that are screaming like, they're being murdered. And and the mama just keeps grazing along like, I didn't see that, I don't know what's going on. But no, we're huge fans of netting, but the training is essential. If they're not trained to it, it really can be an issue.
Yeah, and that's, I think, with the most important thing that I've learned with goats is the psychology of goats. So looking at each situation, like if we're ever getting new goats, especially with San Clemente's, as we look at trying to preserve a breed, we're going to end up with animals that may be slightly more aware or more likely to want to escape than your other goats, right? So, and then when you first get a new goat, they don't know you, they don't know your facility, that's when there's the highest risk for them to escape. And I know they can clear 6-foot fences without much lead for jumping. So that is definitely a challenge of how do you get those animals adapted to your management and your facility.
I've used the Electronet, and we've actually moved away from it for 2 reasons. One, the horns easily get caught on it, and I've lost sheep. Fortunately, I haven't lost any of the goats to it, but I've lost sheep to it because of horns. But the second reason is in our really dry summers. I mean, it works really well in the winter when it's moist, but in our dry summers, there is no amount of water I can pour around the netting, or how many grounds I have, or running alternate positive to negative strands. It just doesn't conduct a current. So around May it stops working, and then into November before it starts working again, and that just didn't work for us.
Yeah, when we have dry weather, we go out and we water the Energizer. The other thing to consider is horn spread. Like, if your animals are naturally curious, which they are, like if they know people and somebody walks up to the fence and they just are curious, if their horns can catch that fence. Like, that's the biggest issue. Or if you put a water too close to the fence, Or if you like throw treats over and they go to reach those treats and they pick their head up and they hook the fence. And then once they're scared and then the fence comes down and then all the goats get out and you have lots of fun.
Yeah. We had actually tried to go to more of the poly rope, like a 4 or 5 line poly rope, because they don't get their horns caught in it. We haven't lost any sheep to that, but we still had the problem with summer. And I'll use that occasionally in the winter. It's a little bit easier to manage, but still summer. I don't know if it's particularly our climate or our soil, but it doesn't conduct electricity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so another consideration with fence is if you're using non-electric fence. So when we first started, we have some non-electric fences, right? And in the spring, the goats would start itching the posts, and then the fence would lean a little bit, and then they can start to climb it. Because I have goats, some of my San Clemente's I had in a ravine, and they can climb vertical rock faces. So if you start to get a tilt to a fence, then you end up in this situation. So super important making sure your fence, whether it's electric, whether it's non-electric, that it's tall and tight. Especially so we built, there's a picture of it later, but where we put any new goats that we're trying to acclimate or hire strong goats into a really, really secure fence. And then just making sure that over time that all of our goats are trained to come to a bucket for treats, so that if they ever do get out, I know that they'll come when I call, so that I can get them back in. Because with goats, it's not a matter of if they get out, it's more when they get out. So a little more of the San Clemente considerations. So I graze goats to target invasive species. So I graze a lot of crazy locations, and I don't take all of my goats. So what I mean by that is I have certain goats that qualify to be grazing goats that can go out on grazing jobs. I cull heavy for behavior. So when you're talking about preserving a rare breed, culling for behavior is not necessarily a viable option, right? So like with my Kikos and my crosses, if they don't stay if they jump the fence, then they come home and they eventually get a new home. But with the San Clemente's, some of the San Clemente's I do take out on grazing jobs, and some of them will never leave this farm because they are flightier. It's knowing your goats, knowing their personalities. So before we take a goat out of our training system, if you will, making sure they're bonded to the herd, because when you get new herds of goats, they can create that sub-herd, and that sub-herd might not blend with your big herd, and then that can create an array of unique management concerns. So that's just something. I'm thinking most of you run multiple breeds of goats. I know, Erin, you have just San Clemente.
I've got Alpines, and I have seen that the San Clemente's will separate, and then they'll be ready to come back to the shed and the Alpines aren't, or they're ready to go graze and the Alpines aren't, and there's a big screaming match, and they all have to argue it out. But yeah, I've definitely seen them segregate.
Yep.
Yeah, mine are racist too.
What I've found with my goats is, they have their family unit bonds, but then also the ones from different herds. And eventually they can meld together, but even still they do have their little buddies. So trying to get them to function as a herd, especially on grazing jobs, is a little more intriguing, if you will. So we have the luxury of, we used to have dairy cows, and we just sold our cows this past June. So we've been in the process of converting over 3 different barns for goats. So we've got 2 of them converted over, and the third one will convert over this year because it requires cement and dynamite. But that has given us a good ability to create like that safe, bomb-proof home. So like this pen right here, there's actually 2 pens next to each other. The fences are 6 feet tall. And then we lined the inside with whatever fencing we had available that had smaller wire openings so that they couldn't get out. And so far, knock on wood, the only time they've gotten out of this is when you walk in to give, you open the gate and then they're like, aha, a gate. But they really don't get out that much. So we finally achieved an almost goat-proof pen, but also we've culled any goats that would be problematic. Our San Clementes have blended in really well with the herd. As far as we don't have ones that want to escape. We did have a buck that really liked to try to escape, but it turns out that he could not clear a 7-foot fence, so that was good. So we learned that 7 feet or higher for our bucks. We're able to keep them in. And like some of this fences, I mean, it's wrought iron. It's not, or double wood. I mean, it's crazy. Yeah.
Stephanie?
Yeah.
I was looking at you said you wanted this interactive, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I was looking at your wire you've got there on your fencing, and I wanted to point out something to people. Yours looks good and tight up against, whatever else you've layered it on there with. But one of our, it was our second accident loss in 18 years for goats. Our only 2 accident losses were both fencing. One was electronet. A kid got tangled in some that was not caught. But the second was an older doe. We had a cistern here on the property, and it had a pretty flimsy fence around it. A cistern at an old house place. It was just a giant hole in the ground. And it had a fence around it, and we thought, well, that's not sufficient, so we're going to put a stronger fence around it. And we just layered field fence around what was already there and tied it together. But it was not tied together tightly. And a doe got her head, there was brush growing up in there, and of course she had to eat that and not the stuff outside. And she got her head between the 2 wires. She was disbutted, so no horns, but she somehow sandwiched herself in between the 2 wires of the 2 different fences and choked herself, and we found her dead. It was horrible. And so now I never, ever layer 2 fences unless they are super secured together. So everybody needs to be cautious with that.
Yeah.
That's a great point, Christy. We inherited a real hodgepodge of fencing that's been patched and repatched, and we have lots of those kind of situations where there's been quick repair jobs that aren't very tight, and that's a real hazard I can see, because somehow they just manage to go for those spots, get stuck.
Yeah. So with grazing, every year we get at least 1 goat that gets stuck in a tree. They are just curious little buggers. So yeah, the other consideration, like in this picture, it's kind of hard to see, but we put the fencing on the inside of the post because it gives it more stability when they push out against it, if that makes sense. Definitely making sure it's tall and tight without gaps. We do have one section in here that has larger spacing in it, and there's 1 goat that routinely gets her head stuck, so we're going to have to switch her to a different pen. But just, yeah, goats are... Oh my gosh. And then one of them, my husband said he freed a goat yesterday because we were feeding, and all of a sudden we heard bloody murder screaming. Well, she had gotten her ear tag somehow caught in the fence. So just those goats are crafty. Like, they are so crafty.
Yeah. Nice way of putting it.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely used other words. Um, but yeah, oh my gosh, the goats have done some crazy things where, so like with Goats on the Go, we share pictures with other affiliates. And so every year, you know, it's like where's the craziest place you've found a goat? Oh, I didn't even think to put that in here. This year I had 2 goats end up on a dock in a river. Yep, that was really interesting. So we managed to get them off the dock without them jumping into the river, but they cleared I'm thinking they either got stung by a bee or spooked by something, because they cleared a 3-foot fence to get onto the dock to begin with. So goats are crafty. So here's another, this is it's a larger, heavier gate is an old cattle gate, it's a swing gate. We call this the fight gate because we obviously lined it with that 4x4 or 3x3 fencing, but there's 2 different pens of goats and they like to fight each other through the fence. Like they're just destructive. Like they just pick fights with each other for no reason. So having really, really sturdy fences is critical. And then just minimizing gaps. I don't know, not much to say about this, but fencing is fun.
Could I to add to that, Stephanie, an interesting is psychology and all of that fun stuff, but I've had to split up bucks that were in rut, and I had a cattle panel fence between them, and one of them actually broke through the cattle panel to get to the other bucks to do fighting, and while they fought pretty hard, I let them do it, and they stopped. But it is scary to see goats wanting to fight each other. But I wonder about those barrier pieces sometimes, if that antagonizes. I don't know how goats fully work at all, but yeah, they can be really rough on that stuff.
Yeah, so that brings up a great point. So in the freestyle barn, which is the barn in the background here, we've got different pens, and then they just have that woven wire between them, and they've actually busted part of those cross pieces in the woven wire, so they can then they get their heads through, or then you get like crafty ones that can then get their bodies through. Goats are so destructive because they're just trying to headbutt each other through fences, even though they get along. The other thing too is, so this particular fence that we're looking at now, we had a buck in the far group, and then the group on this side is our yearling does that we didn't want bred. So when those does come in heat, they just line the fence. And it's not a solid fence, so hopefully we're not going to have any surprise babies, but it could be a thing, right? So in our freestyle barn, there's some plywood fencing up as well, but the plywood fencing is connected to metal, like these metal gates with, it's wired to it. And I think we're going to have to get bolts, but I'm not even sure if bolts will work, because what the goats are doing, especially the San Clementes, they're crafty. Where the wire connector is, they take their head and they somehow jam their horn up in there and just itch, and then they snap the wire, so eventually the plywood's going to fall off. So we have to keep an eye on that. But on the flip side, if we put U-bolts with little nuts, we can't have any nuts facing the goats because they get bored and they work their little lips and they will take nuts off of any bolts. I don't know if anyone else has experienced that, but we have. It's crazy what these guys can do.
That's very crazy. I've not heard of that.
Yeah, the most successful fencing we have right now, or like hooks I should say, is actually just link chain, I think that's what it's called, and then like snap hooks, or like, because we've had like we had a feeder that connected with nuts and bolts, and then all the little nuts go missing, and it's like you little. And then I've watched them do it, and I'm like, you crafty little buggers. Maybe they need more to do in a day. I don't know. So one of the smartest things I did this year is I was able to save up and finally buy a significant number of corral panels. So these are by the truck. We built a temporary corral. It's made for goats, so it's got smaller spacing. I think it's 4-inch spacing, but because they're vertical bars, they don't really get their heads. I haven't had any get their heads stuck yet, but to have portable fencing to set up, take down, move around, the flexibility of it, and so far nobody's jumped the fence. I mean, it's only 4 feet, but it even keeps the bucks in.
Where did you get them?
Right by Erin, through Riverland Ag, but I think they're made by a place down in Georgia. But I got them in bundles of 25. They're like $110 a piece. So they're an investment, but absolutely worth it. I'll try to look up the information and find it and send it to you.
Okay. Have you put any bucks in there to see if their beating of the fence is too much for the gauge of the panels?
I think bucks would eventually probably destroy this.
Okay.
I think bucks would destroy anything, to be honest with you.
Well, I found I use stallion corral panels, which have a smaller spacing than regular horse panels, and like my young bucks will get out of it, but the older bucks can't. But it's because it's for stallions. So far, even when they fight across the fence, they haven't bent it. And I've been using it for my bucks for a couple of years. But I'm just curious because I've wanted to get some of these sheep or goat panels as well, but I just haven't seen the right gauge that I think would be strong enough for goats fighting across it.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. So we're, I guess, lucky enough now that we have the cow barn. I mean, it's a cement wall. But even still, like, they're just, oh my gosh. So what I did with my bucks this year is I put virtual collars on them, and they lived miles away in the woods for the summer. So they all live together in their little bachelor herd, miles from any females, so I didn't have any issues. And then right now we're going to start kidding the end of March, and so then I will pull. I've got 2 bucks running with the does right now just because I haven't figured out quite yet where to put the bucks now that all the does are home for the winter. But yeah, so this fence, it's really good for what I'm using it for. I do have one panel that is bent, and I don't know, it might have been like a love tap from the skid steer, or it might have been the goats and the sheep. I'm not quite sure. But the flexibility of this, and these panels are light enough that I can pick them up, throw them in the truck, drive them somewhere, and then set them back up again. And then also, because they're obviously not electric netting, it's a more solid containment. So here, this group is they were in a 40-acre ravine, and they were all on virtual collars, and so I would just feed them. I had their mineral blocks in here and crackers, so whenever I needed them, they were all trained to run in this corral, and I could shut the gates, and then you can just grab whoever you need, because it was a small enough space that once they're in there, there's no escape potential, because they don't have that extra room to run around and like get away from you. They're all a fairly tight area. So I guess I can talk a little bit about the collars. So what I started doing this year, and the San Clementes are doing really well on these collars too, is using the virtual collars for containment. Oops. Oh, I guess I will go back to that one. So I use the virtual collars wherever I can. They work really well for me. There are some caveats to using virtual collars, like you have to have really good cell service. So it's not going to work everywhere, but for me it works because I'm in a fairly urban area. So what that looks like for me is that I use it to contain my goats, and it's set up with audible cues, so as they approach a virtual boundary, they hear tones that tell them that is as far as they can go. If they were to keep going, they would get an electric impulse, which would then encourage them not to go farther. But once they're trained, they hear those beeps and they hardly ever get any shots. So on the right is an actual screenshot of one particular goat who lives on a golf course in the summer, because I have bougie golf course goats. And the musical notes are where he was testing the boundary. And in this case, you'll notice the musical notes are all by golf holes because he likes people. But so he was notified 195 times, and this is in less than 24 hours, by the way, 195 times that he had reached the boundary, and he received 0 shocks because he knew he couldn't go any farther. So it works really well if the goats are trained to it. Obviously, there's no physical fence, so I haven't had any issues with predators. The only escapes that I've had have been when the goats were motivated to escape. Oh, what I mean by that is, so the goats on the golf course, poor Climby, he got pegged by a golf ball, and then he took off. And so he was the leader of his group, so I got an immediate notification that these 3 goats had escaped. So I looked at my phone, and they'd run across, like, the 9th hole, and we're on the other side, and I'm like, okay, well, I'll just run. I now need to go check on them, figure out what's going on. And by the time I got to the golf course, which is only 10 minutes away, they'd already returned to their pasture because they knew that's where they had belonged. But when we pulled into the golf course, it turns out there was a company outing that day, so a lot of less than skilled golfers. So we were walking where they had escaped, and poor Climby was just really nervous. Like, he's normally a really chill guy. He was really nervous, and then it turns out we're standing there, and you can hear the balls hitting the trees. These golfers were so bad that their golf balls were going like where they normally never go, and the poor goats were just a little shell-shocked. But that was the only time we had an incident with them. Domestic dogs are the other challenge we have out on grazing sites. We had a few instances where just barking dogs, it's that natural predator-prey relationship, right? So that's a big thing too. But we've learned that our goats really, like, once they learn where they're supposed to be, like on our grazing sites, we call it the home spot. Even if they were to escape, they will return to like where we drop them off with the trailer. Like, they have that homing instinct. So I guess that's where we're really careful if we ever get new goats, of just trying to make sure that they can learn our farm and learn where the home spot is, so if anything ever was to happen, they'd have that place to return to, because we've spent our time chasing loose goats, and we've learned a lot in the process.
Tell me about this system that you're using. Is it smart enough to where if the goat, for some reason, is chased off or scared off outside the boundary and gets the shock, can it come back without a shock?
Absolutely.
Okay, so it's smart enough to know to let them go back in.
Yep, it's one directional. So if the goat escapes, it shuts it off and it puts it in, like, emergency status isn't the right way. But until that goat registers back into its fence, it won't do any shocks at all. So
that's really cool.
Yeah, for me, with what I do for grazing, I also work full-time. I can check on the location of my goats anytime, anywhere. It also has movement detectors. So, like, if the collar stops moving, most likely it fell off the goat or the goat is dead. Or if you have one goat who's separate from the rest of the herd but still moving, you can figure out, like, okay, well, maybe I should go figure out why this goat is all by itself. So for me, I had an incident where we had a grazing job where we were using the collars and we were using electric netting. So 2 forms of fence. And the neighbor's dogs, the neighbor had 4 dogs, and the goats had been there 3 days. The neighbor's dogs came out and just bark, 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 scared the goats. They ran for 2 miles. So as soon as they hit the border, I got a notification on my phone. So I was about to call the homeowner just as she was calling me to tell me that there was a problem. And then I was able to track exactly where the goats were running, so that we could get them once they stopped running. So they ran for 2 miles, ended up at a pallet factory, and then had stopped to actually catch a breath. And we got there with the truck and trailer, and my husband was like, well, how are we going to get them on the trailer? Well, we home spot, right? The goats know the trailer, open the trailer door, and they all jumped right on because they know the trailer is safe.
That's cool.
But that's a lot of training to get to that point, right? So I've got a few San Clementes that are that trained. I also have a few San Clementes that I do send out on grazing jobs when we go for loading, because that's when there might be somebody new, or you get people, my problem is, and people they don't mean to be harmful, but you get general public people who are like, oh, I'm going to watch you load goats. And you're like, oh, because the goats that are like, oh my God, there's someone new. And that's when they're likely to do crazy things. So we've learned, which goats, if we have goats that don't load well, just manage them appropriately. I know the San Clementes are definitely, they're great animals. They just take a special skill set, right?
Absolutely.
We've done the trailer acclimation thing when we've got some in the past that have been jumpy and, we haven't handled them. And so we'll park our little goat hauling trailer in their pen for a week or 2 before sale barn day and, feed them on it and everything, get them used to it. But you've got to beware that they will eat the wiring off your trailer.
Yep.
So you got to make sure that's protected, but it works great.
Yeah. I've been trying to figure out, I just bought a new trailer, and I'm like, how do I get the trailer in a place where I can leave it so that they can get in practice loading and unloading, right? But I don't want to park the trailer and walk away because then they'll eat the wiring, right? So, goats.
Yep, we can attest to that. What is the name of the system that you're using, the virtual fence system?
Yeah, so right now in the U.S., the only company that does sheep and goat collars is called No Fence. In the next couple years, there will be additional brands in the U.S.
Are you using the No Fence one?
Yep.
Can you give us a rough idea of what the cost parameters are?
It's expensive. So the basic collar is $199, but then you're going to need a spare battery and some other stuff. And then there's a subscription fee, which is about $50-ish, depends upon if you have 50 or more goats on collars. So the way I do it is I figured out it's a 5-year life expectancy. So $200 for the collar, plus some batteries, some neck straps, a charger, and then your yearly usage fee. So I figure $100 a year per collar on average, if you take it and spread it out over 5 years. So does the collar provide an economic return of $100 or more to justify its use? And that's where the discussion gets fun.
Yeah, exactly. So is the subscription fee $50 per month per collar?
Per year, sorry.
Per year per collar.
Yeah.
So about $4 a month.
Yes. And then depending upon, like, there's different plans. So this is getting into the weeds a little bit. But like there's one option where if you only use it for like, say, 3 months, you can pay a monthly fee instead of a yearly fee. So where no fence or where any virtual fencing system really pays for itself is in the ability to increase daily moves. So if you're looking at high impact grazing, you can move your animals multiple times a day. And then it's obviously much easier to set up a fence on a phone than it is to put a fence in a ravine.
Right. How long do the batteries on the collar last?
Depends upon the goat. So there are certain goats that will never interact with a boundary. They just like watch the other goats. And then you have your leader goats, like Climby, who will test that boundary. I actually have videos of some of the goats. They've learned exactly how many seconds they have before they get shot.
Oh, wow.
So when you hear those beeps, they will keep going until the absolute last second, and then they'll turn so they don't get shot. So those goats, so I have some goats that we change batteries on every 3 weeks, and then I have other goats where they go a whole season. And it also depends upon access to sunlight. So Climby, even though he tested his battery all the time, he and his buddies at this golf course would sleep on rocks on top of the ravine in the sun. So they were able to keep their own batteries charged the entire season.
Oh, so there's a solar charger on the battery?
Yep, so there's a solar charger, and then it backs up with a battery that you actually take out and replace, and then charge it and put it back. So that's where you need like 1.4 batteries per collar, depending upon how often you want to change them.
Have you put any of these on your livestock guardian dogs?
I don't have livestock guardian dogs. I live in a fairly urban area. I live right next to a housing development, and I live next to a highway. So we don't have the predator issues, knock on wood, other than domestic dogs. So we've thought about getting LGDs, but our concern is barking.
Yep.
Because if we're next to a subdivision and we have barky dogs all night, that's going to be a problem.
Oh, yep. And that's their first line of defense, yeah.
Yep. So, I mean, if they're barking for a reason, that's fine. But if it's like barking for hours on end, so I'm very supportive of LGDs, but they don't work in our situation.
Yeah.
We do have a donkey. And then different people have, like, if you run different species of animals together, if they're well bonded, I've heard people say that if they run bonded cattle with the goats, if there's an issue, the cattle or the goats will run to the cows and hide among the cows. But you got to make sure your animals know each other, because we graze. I was doing a multi-species grazing project, and we brought over some goats that I thought were familiar with cows, but they took one look at these dairy heifers and took off. And that led into a multi-day recon effort, which would not recommend. And then the next group of goats we brought, the exact opposite happened. They were so curious, and they're Kikos, and they were like, what are these giant things? We better chase them. So then the goats were chasing the heifers. So animals are fun.
Yeah.
Make sure you do all the trials at home with a really, really sturdy fence, and then you can venture out into electric netting and virtual fencing. The other things I don't know if anyone else has done this, but using water as a natural barrier. Water is goat kryptonite. I don't know if anyone else has noticed that. So we do a lot of ravine or lakefront or riverfront work, and I don't even bother, like, as long as it's more than 6 feet wide, and even then, that's still wide enough. Like, I've got goats that won't even jump across like 6 inches of water. So obviously that's not going to hold every goat in, but just grazing next to lakes and stuff, I can use that as a natural barrier from time to time. And I think that's all I had for pictures and stuff. I thought we'd have more of a fun discussion on fencing and see what else you guys want to learn.
So how small of an area, if I were going to build a fence, let's say a 6 or 7 foot tall fence to keep a buck or a new animal coming to the farm that I'm afraid might jump, how small of a space would I have to make that? Okay, let's say I wanted to use a 5 foot fence. And I've heard it said that if the space is small enough, they won't be able to jump it. So what size would everyone suggest that be?
So I used to think that logic would work, but we have one of my son's 4-H goats, which is the only reason she's still here. She can jump 6 feet on the ground from standing still. It's the craziest thing. But I think she's more of the exception than the rule. And there's also, I think, a genetic factor in that. Like, her mom was a jumper, so that's where I do a lot of culling by behavior, but that doesn't work with San Clemente's. I don't know how small of a space you could get away with. For me, because gates, everything comes in 8 foot sections, an 8 by 8 square, but that definitely is jumpable.
If we have somebody we're worried about with quarantine, we use modified chicken tractors that are hoops, cattle panel hoops. So it's movable, so you don't need to worry about a large space. And our smallest one is 8 by 8, but most of them are 8 by 16, completely covered over the top.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think mine are 8 by 8 or so, like that.
My big jumpers, they don't take a running stand at it. They stand right next to the fence, and it almost looks like they're jumping vertically and just clear it. So I'm not sure the size of the pen would affect it too much.
Okay, so just go with the height then.
The height, yeah. And maybe, I mean, if you can somehow slant it inward a little, that could possibly deter them because it would optically confuse them.
Yeah.
We've, in general, especially once a goat is acclimated to our property, we've never had jumping issues. Right. And I think part of that's because we use electric hot wires. And so even though all of our woven wire fencing is only 4 feet tall, we have hot wires that go up to 6 feet, and depending on where they are on the fence are anywhere from 4 to 12 inches in. And I really do think that makes a difference because they can't see a way over easily because there's wires in their way and they're hot and they've gotten shocked, on their nose or whatever. So if you do have electric, it doesn't sound like would work for Lisa, but if you're able to use electric, I mean, I highly recommend it. It keeps goats off the fence and it keeps them from destroying it.
Absolutely. So
yeah, I mean, that kind of wire you can plug in, right? Yeah.
And if you're running a hot wire just across the top, it has a much higher chance of staying hot because you're not getting the weed pressure on the fence. So that's where, like, for the equip contract that I'm hoping to do this year, it's woven wire fence, but with that electric on top or even offset on the inside to keep them from itching the fence, but to keep them from, it's also intended to keep the animals in, but also to keep predators out, because if predators go to jump the fence, they'll hit that hot wire too.
Ours is
Exactly.
offset. Our electric is offset on the inside, and the bucks just don't even. I mean, they don't think twice. They just up and over. So I think we need to go on top, which would mean putting post extensions because none of our posts are tall enough for that right now. So yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing I will recommend that we've added slowly over the years is they now have available like flashing lights and stuff that you can put onto your hot wires. So from a distance, you can see, that, especially if you're in areas where you get storms and electric's out, you can see, I don't know, a few hundred feet out, like, oh yeah, my wire's still hot. There's the flashing red light.
Well, that's cool.
And I'm a huge fan of those.
The other thing they've just come out with, and I have not yet tried this. Oh shoot, they just had it. Was the electric fence monitoring thing. Oh my gosh, I'm just drawing a brain fart. Monitor, there we go. They've got this new smart satellite system, so it will monitor the voltage of your fence from your phone. So theoretically, if your fence isn't working, then you get a notification.
Oh, I like that. And if people do not get the Premier catalog, I highly recommend it. Even if you never buy from Premier, it is just a wonderful how-to manual, to give you ideas on how to set up fencing and stuff. And their website also, lots of great information.
And they also have customer service is good.
Yes, and Premier does run their own sheep. So this isn't just some company out there. This is, these are farmers who are, using this fencing. So that it does, they want it to be successful because they want to be successful.
Yeah. I've got a few friends that are just trying this electric fence monitor, so I'll get feedback from them, but from so far it looks good. I know that Gallagher also has some smart fencing products too, but then you're obviously getting into a lot more expense. So most of these fence monitoring systems are made for larger operations, larger scale.
Yeah,
but this here is a good.
I was going to say, I was just sitting here thinking, my husband would say, I believe I can walk down there and touch the fence cheaper than that. But we're not making, we're not grazing for profit, so.
Right.
Whole different thing.
Right. Well, that's where, like, even with any technology, just because it works for me doesn't mean it's really a smart decision for me or anybody else. I go back and forth on the economics of the collars, but what I'm finding with justifying the virtual fencing, well, number one, I graze on a bunch of crazy sites, and I'm moving goats all the time. So, but the other thing, too, is the peace of mind, because I know where those little buggers are anytime. Like, even if they were to escape, I know exactly where they are. But how do you cash flow all that, right? Yeah.
I don't know that anybody else lives in a really, I'm going to call it rugged terrain with cliffs and whatnot, but the only unique fencing situation we have, I think I shared a picture of it with Aaron. We've got a bluff line on our property, and it's tall enough that the goats won't go off of it, believe it or not. But we needed to run a fence down to it on our property line. And so we had a jackhammer, and we cemented big wooden posts into the top of the bluff. And then in order to get the fence out far enough, we fenced to the to the post, to like an H brace with our field fence. And then we took a cattle panel and stuck it out over the bluff. We just ran it out past the end of the post, so it's hanging out there in midair. It looks really funny, but we've never had to get around it or through it or anything. So you find creative ways to build fences.
Yep.
Hey, Stephanie, have you used that Gallagher, is it a 4-strand portable electric fence that I've seen Leslie use?
I have not. I've thought about it, but then I wonder about kids, and then I wonder about, someone told me, like, well, what if one wire breaks, then it's hard to fix, then the whole thing is junk. But I don't know if there's any validity to that or not. I've thought about it, but I just haven't. I don't know. I mean, I've seen it. I've got a friend who that's all he uses for his sheep. But I just, maybe someday I'll try it.
Yeah, I've that's been kind of in the back of my head a little bit, just in the mix of using net fence in the summertime is that, but it's all, I don't know, it's awfully expensive too, just like everything else. So, and I know how net fence works.
Yeah, I got started with the Electronet, and it's like, well, I don't know. Yeah, I might buy a reel just to play with it, but then again, we'll see.
Yeah.
Say, Aaron, I have actually looked at getting that same system, and I wouldn't be too worried about a strand breaking because it's pretty easy to replace. You know, in my opinion, I know that I could fix it. But currently, when I go through the woods and it's too thick for me to bring a net fence through because I have tons of buckthorn where I am, I take rebar, and I just have it 48 inches tall. I put that into the ground so the top wire is only 36 inches tall, and I run 3 strands of wire through the woods, and I do not have a problem with my goats at all. They respect it 100%, and I've had 0 problems with them. So, you know, that's a very inexpensive alternative if your goats are comfortable with you. But as you guys know, my goats will climb all over me if I let them. But even with the new batch that I got this year and integrating them, I made sure that they were very integrated with the whole herd before I let them out. And it was about 3 months. But they've been doing very well. None of them have been shocked by it. They see the other goats stay away from it, and they just learn from them.
That's actually a big piece that I've recognized over the years of using electric fence and training. They remember. Like when I break the fence out in the spring and do that first paddock of training, holy smokes, do the old ones remember. I barely have, it's like the new kids that try to test the fence, but everybody else is like, no, I remember that junk.
And I've learned that, like, the moms teach the babies too.
Definitely, yeah.
I haven't had any throw their kids into the fence like Sarah, but
that's just sad because it's so fun to watch. It's like goat hockey, checking them into the, backboards.
It is that, I don't know, trying to think of the best word for it, but it is rewarding to hear a goat screaming in electric, being shocked, than it is to hear it being like screaming because it's, tangled.
Agree. Yeah. Yeah, we laugh.
yeah, animals and kids are fun.
You're a bad influence, Stephanie. I have this smart satellite monitor sitting in my cart.
I am not affiliated with Premier One. I wish I had the ability to be like, and you get a discount, and you get a discount, and I get a kickback, but no.
No. I was gonna say we got our first electronetting in 2008, and it's still in use from Premier One. So I'm just a huge fan of them to begin with. So it's held up well.
Yeah, that's about how old ours is, and we don't use it all the time, but it's still, when we get ready to put it up for something, it's still working great.
Yeah, it's very impressive. And I will say, too, our first was actual goat fencing, but everything since then, we've moved to poultry fencing because we do run multiple species, including poultry, and I just like the 48-inch versus the, I think, 36 is the goat fencing, and the smaller holes.
Yeah, I think poultry is what we bought in the beginning.
I did that too. What color poultry net do you use?
Mine is white.
Yeah, same.
Or
So,
white.
I have green poultry net, and I swear that my goats I wonder if the color green is just off for them, because I had more goats get tangled in the green fence than like white fencing. Like there's like something, I don't know if there's any validity to it or not, but
I would say that's a possibility. Our livestock guardians, of course, are trained to electric, and we had across the top of a gate one of the yellow and black plastic strands with the wire through it, and we had it down on the ground, so i.e. it wasn't even charged. And here we have a 150-pound male Great Pyrenees, and he realized he was sitting on it, and he yelped and ran because he saw the color and saw it. And I'm like, what a dork. There was no, obviously it didn't, hit you or charge you or anything, but the color alone set him off. Does anybody have any other questions or thoughts on fencing?
George shared a link to Ken Cove. I personally haven't used Ken Cove, but I hear great things about them. So that's another option. There's definitely a quality difference in electric netting. Don't get the cheap stuff off Amazon.
Very true. The investment is worth it if you think you're going to enjoy netting.
Of course.
Anyone else? Well, if there's no other comments, I'd like to thank Stephanie. I see Lisa unmuted herself. Lisa, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I had a question. As a hopefully soon-to-be goat owner, whose main problem right now is we don't have any fencing yet, what would be your single most best advice for somebody who's going to be hiring somebody to install fencing? I have priced 2x4-inch 5-foot woven wire. So that is available in my area. I haven't seen anything taller than the 60-inch.
They can get their...
Just my advice from a person who's going on my third round of replacing pasture fencing is buy the good stuff, get it installed right, get something that's going to really last, because the less expensive stuff is you're going to be replacing it in 2 to 3 years with goats. So why pay for it twice?
What kind of wire are you using now?
Well, I started, the main perimeter of my farm has the Red Brand cattle field fencing. And for the most part, that's okay, because they don't challenge it too much, but I also did that for all my interior cross fencing, and it just got destroyed. Heads through the fence, butting it. I mean, it's amazing how much they can disintegrate that. So then I went to 4x4 sheep and goat fencing, and I put that in all of my cross sections.
And they stand on it.
And they stand on it, and they butt it, and the little babies put their head through, and they work it, and they work it, and work it, and now that's all destroyed. So now I'm going to the 2-inch by 4-inch no climb horse fencing in the extra heavy gauge. And that's going to go in most areas, or I'm actually going to put cattle and combo panels with that really heavy gauge, because I mean, I've already spent so much money on cross fencing. I don't want to be doing this every 2 to 3 years. The 4x4-inch is 2 years ago. I replaced all those fences, and they're just destroyed. So I gotta do something heavier, and I don't want to be doing this again in 2 years. I do not like fencing.
My advice would be to start with your perimeter and cross fencing only where you know you're absolutely going to want it, because as you're learning your property and you're learning how your goats graze and how you want it to graze, it's a waste of money to put in permanent cross fencing until you know where you want it. Our entire perimeter is 4x4 square, and we've had the same 4x4 square up now for 16 years. And I think the reason we don't have issues like Lisa is because we have hot wires on both sides of it for both. So our goats can't get to it to headbutt. They can't get to it to rub or anything like that. And then we run, and our cross fencing is a variety of stuff. We change as we have decided what to do. A lot of it is electric netting. We have 6-strand high tensile, and then we only have 4x4 in cross fencing, like for our big pastures that we know, like, you know, we want the pasture to end here because this is going to be our garden, or this is our yard. And so, we filled in cross fencing later at other dates.
I wanted to add too to new Lisa, if you have the opportunity to go look at other people's fencing setups that they have, that might really be helpful. And maybe I misheard you, but I think you said you might contract somebody to build fencing, because that's a different kind of piece you want to be able to explain really well. But I've seen some really stellar perimeter fencing at like my friends down the road that had a bigger sheep production farm, and I want that fence so bad, and that's fencing in around 200 acres, I think. If I had my dream fencing, I would just throw up cattle panel as a perimeter. I forget what the square size of it, but like throw that up with a hot wire on the inside, and that's easy to install too, you know. But that's just my little dream wish and thoughts towards your fencing.
We haven't been able to go. Let me put the video on here. We haven't been able to go visit anybody. We really don't know anybody up here that has livestock. But we did, for our local Agway, I had asked there if they knew anybody that did livestock fencing installation. And they did. They had a reference, and they said they did a very good job on their own property. So yeah, we are going to contract that out because my husband and I are both too old and broken to do it ourselves. I have a post rammer. I can do some T-posts or what have you, but anything beyond that is not gonna happen. So we are going to contract it out, and we have the name. We just have to get like an estimate. Now, keep in mind, we're really small. We only have about 4.5 acres, and some of that is woods. Our idea, and we do live on a kind of a busy road. There are some milk trucks. There's a lot of dairies in the area. They go back and forth between the farms, and there's a couple cheese makers in the area. So they drive very fast. So we want to make sure that there aren't any escapes under the road because they very likely might not survive. We want to get the good, especially on that front road, we want to get really good fencing. So that's why we want to go with at least the 5 foot and get good solid fencing as a perimeter. And then our thought process was to divide the main area that we want to fence off into thirds for like rotation, be able to do like some parasite control when we need to. So that's our thought process. But like I said, we're newbies to livestock, and so it's been a steep learning process. I've been copiously taking notes here tonight.
Awesome. The electric net fencing is, like it was mentioned before, a really good option to have rotation inside of your perimeter fence without putting up that permanent fence too. And even the e-collars are really cool too for a situation like that, but you probably don't need those for such a small chunk. But how awesome is it to just move your animals from the inside of your house and keep an eye on them too. And it's something, you probably know this too, but like if you have a busy road and you get new goats, it is acclimating them to that noise too, so they just get used to it instead of freaking out. So, but yeah, that's actually what a joy to have somebody build a fence for you. Maybe I'll get to that point someday.
The thing we're concerned right now about is the chunk of money that's going to be required to do it. So
yeah, it's going to be worth it.
We need to get that estimate.
Yeah.
Be sure that they set your corner posts in concrete. I've seen contractors not set them in concrete, and then when you pull your fence tight, which as Stephanie said, you need it tight, then it leans. And we even set some of ours in concrete, and they still lean. We had to go back and rethink. But yeah, be sure they do that.
Yeah, I'll be like I said, this is we only have the one name, so it's not like we can do competing estimates or anything. But I'll definitely be asking them a lot of questions when the time comes. So, and I'm not sure how soon this is going to happen because we've got some things that are up in the air right now. But fingers crossed that it happens this year. I mean, we wanted to do try and get a grant from the Livestock Conservancy, but the timing of the grant process and the timing of what we're hoping to do don't line up very well. So we'll see what we're going to be able to accomplish this year.
Anyone else? Let me see, is there anything in chat I need to look at? All right. Well, Lisa, did you have something you wanted? I thought she came off mute.
I was just going to, I'm going to message or chat Aaron.
Well, if nobody else has anything, we'd like to thank Stephanie so much for leading tonight's discussion and for her insight into the different types of fencing. We really appreciate it, and I appreciate all of y'all being here. And so please come back and join us next month when we have Karen Kopf from Kopf Canyon Kikos in Idaho, who will be talking about record keeping and how she has used record keeping to create a world-class Kiko breeding program. So if you have questions you want to ask her, please send them either mine or Erin Link's way, because we will be sending them to her ahead of time. And that is all we have for tonight. Everybody have a great rest of your week, and hopefully we will see you next month. Same time, same place. Night, y'all.
Hey, everybody.